everyone, my name is Jill and I'll be giving a lecture on adjudication. So before I continue, I just want to posit a disclaimer. I don't claim to know everything about judging and debating as a whole. All the things that I'll be talking about are based on a lot of my experiences within the debate circuit or as a judge, and as well as based on the different references that I was able to consume throughout my experience in judging and debating for that matter, whether that's reading the WDC Judge Manual or looking up in different seminars and YouTube and like attending different in-person events that talks about judging and debating. So I'll try my best to be able to link a lot of the references at the end of these at the end of this lecture, but generally I just want to posit that the knowledge that I'm going to share here is also knowledge that you can find in other references. This is merely just like a compilation and like tidbits of how I perceive judging and based on the experiences and the references that I was able to consume. So just a general overview as for like what exactly I'll be talking about in this lecture. This lecture will be divided into 4 parts. Firstly, on the general view of adjudication. Second is on tracking. So this is where we start to go to more skill-specific parts of adjudication or judging. A third would be on oral adjudication. And lastly, in terms of self-improvement, which we discuss things more about training, regimen, regimen, and anything else beyond that. So let's get on to the general overview of adjudication. So firstly, let's define what exactly is adjudication or judging. So adjudicators or judges assess debates without prejudice, which team in the debate was the most persuasive. In debating, persuasiveness is rooted in the plausible reasons that are offered to show that it is true and important. So this is applicable to all formats, regardless if it's BP or AP judging. The idea behind it is the plausible reasons are usually based on logic, or they're not necessarily things that are required to be based on facts. Like logic can be derived from facts, but the idea behind it is when teams or when debaters are trying to prove things, you aren't necessarily basing it off the amount of statistics that they're citing or the amount of examples or like real world things that they're positing, but it's more of how they're demonstrating why certain scenarios, why certain phenomena are likely to happen based on trends, based on different logical conclusions or inferences that they're able to prove and logically explain to you. So, So what exactly is the importance of adjudication? So as a judge or as an adjudicator, you decide who wins or loses in a debate, and you are essentially the central being towards the competitiveness of debating in the first place. Understand that judges are not passive observers. They actively take note of the debate in order to make an informed decision as for who to give the win or loss to. Judges also help improve both debaters and fellow judges, insofar as their role in debating requires them to discuss what debaters could improve on, how they could elevate debates, so that moving forward, they can engage in better discussions and different crossfires. I think it is absolutely important to highlight that significance, because I think there are tendencies where people can downplay judges or the importance of adjudication just because it might be perceived as less important or less entertaining or less fun in that regard as opposed to like debating. But in truth, being a judge is quite important for the rest of the entire debate circuit, because debaters and like having better debates are contingent on the judges being able to evaluate those debates, being able to explain to debaters how they could specifically improve on or what specifically they could do to win over other teams or to generally make their skills as debaters better. So the idea behind it is judges, they're not just merely people who are the foundations of why debating is competitive in the first place, being the person that does decide who wins or loses, but they are also central beings in being able to ensure that the rest of the circuit is able to grow, or the rest of other debaters that they're judging are able to grow and the like. So don't insult judges, don't look down on the track of judge track or judges in general. I think they are essential beings in order for us to be able to enjoy the sport of debating. As a judge, you are also known as the ordinary intelligent voter, also known as the average reasonable voter or average reasonable person. So when you are the ordinary intelligent voter, it's essentially trying to tell you how you should be entering the debate or what type of mindset you should be entering when you go into the debate. It calls the idea of an ordinary intelligent voter calls judges to assess the persuasiveness of speeches according to a set shared of judging criteria rather than according to their own views about the subject matter. So ordinary intelligent voter, or you as a judge, don't necessarily get persuaded by arguments reflecting personal beliefs or preferences. Even if you are someone who is Catholic, you do not automatically give the win to a team that runs a Catholic religious argument. Or if you are an economics major, you do not automatically give the win to someone who mentions different economic jargon but doesn't necessarily explain what those jargons mean. So as an ordinary intelligent voter, so like you shouldn't have specialized matter. So like you generally know of different major international events and bodies. For example, you know that there is the existence of the Russia-Ukraine war. You know that climate change exists, that the IMF and the UN exists in the world. But you do not necessarily have specialized matter on these different topics. What does specialized matter look like? So it looks like knowing the different structures of what the IMF, the specific on-the-ground events in the Russia-Ukraine war, or knowing the specifics of why Russia is losing out money as the conflict is ongoing, or the different incentives that actors may have. So there is a general awareness that certain phenomena exist, but you as a ordinary intelligent voter are not entirely well read to know the exact incentive of actors, the mechanisms that perpetuate certain harms or guarantee benefits from such a phenomena. So the specificities of specific events or specific matter in that regard on these things are what debaters usually try to give to ground their analysis and arguments, but it is not necessarily something that you should be using as a reference, something that you generally have as you enter the debate. So just to recap, as an ordinary intelligent voter, you have the general awareness that things exist, that things are happening, but you don't necessarily know the reason or the different incentives and externalities that might aggravate certain phenomena or that might aggravate or play into certain circumstances. And usually it is those specificities that debaters try to use in terms of being able to ground their logic or being able to argue as they try to give out different points in cases. So this is where we start talking about the responsibilities of an adjudicator with that out of the way. There are 5 main things that an adjudicator generally has to do. Firstly, in terms of tracking. Second, in terms of assessing material. Third is weighing material or weighing contributions. Fourth is decision and providing a decision and going through deliberations. And the fifth being providing an oral adjudication. First, let's talk about tracking. So tracking refers to the trail of logic and taking note of the logical points and process in a speech. This generally helps judges assess whether the claims of judges make sense and whether or not this is something that is persuasive. It's important to note that judges are not transcribers. You as an individual are not tasked to write out speeches of debaters verbatim, but rather you write that what their claims are, what those mechanisms behind those claims are, etc., etc. Essentially, you follow the logic of the speech and not necessarily the speech in and of itself. I think this is important to highlight, especially considering that debaters, they talk really fast. And not only that, I think like it accounts for different accents, it accounts for different language usage, and as well as language proficiencies. So like if you are an EFL or ESL judge, you might have a difficulty in being able to track like an EPL speaker or an English primary language speaker in terms of whatever words that they're dishing out because they're just speaking too fast, or perhaps these are words that you yourself don't necessarily understand or have a difficulty in being able to grasp. So when you're judging, you are not required to transcribe whatever speeches that debaters give. Rather than transcribing, you are focused on the way that teams are positing different logical points or being able to present these different logical points in cases. I think that is important to highlight. Don't fall into the trap that you must be like a listener to just like transcribe. Always remember that as a judge, what you're tracking is not the speech. You are not tracking the specific words per se, but you are tracking the way that the logical progression or the different logical points and conclusions that different teams are making as they provide their speech. Your decisions will be based on how you track the debate and how you track the logical progression of not just speeches, but how you track the logical progression of the debate as a whole. So when you're tracking debates, you ought to be proactive in tracking the debate by asking yourself different different questions? Were you able to catch certain premises that opposition launches and how exactly they bit into government's frame? Were you able to catch that a specific argument can also serve as a response to another argument given by the opponent, even if it wasn't explicitly flagged, etc., etc.? The idea behind it is when you're tracking, you don't just track what is being given to you, but you're also tracking the way that certain material is interacting with another piece of material that you've already initially tracked. You're tracking these different points of logic and the way that they interact with one another. So I think like the best way to discuss it is tracking. You're tracking both the speech, the debate, or the debate. When you're talking about tracking the debate, you're tracking specifically the way certain materials and certain contributions are interacting with one another. Which leads me to the discussion about assessing material. So you have to be able to identify what the contributions or material are, what the material is coming from themes in order for you to be able to track. So material, contribution, they are synonymous, at least in this lecture. So in this case, material or contributions refer to the material being assessed and compared by judges. They are what debaters give and run in debate. So there are different forms of contributions, whether that's arguments, responses, rebuttals, weighing, engagement, impacts. Essentially, whatever debaters give or whatever debaters do in a debate, those are forms of contribution because they are contributing to debate, the different points, the different logic. I hope you get that train of thought. But there are different types of contributions, and it's noteworthy that you as a judge are able to identify what type of contribution it is. Firstly, let's talk about mechanisms. They're also known as the analysis of an argument. These could look like the analysis on the likelihoods or probability of an effect or impact happening, the incentives of actors to behave in a particular way, etc. So this generally discusses the plausibility of something happening, whether that's based on facts, existing trends, or the logical assumptions and proofs made based on existing facts and trends. The second type of contribution is engagement and response. So this refers to a contribution that is meant to respond to something or that directly interacts and clashes with another existing material within the debate. The third type of contribution would be on impact. So impact could refer to two things. First, it could be the effect or end goal of an analysis. The second is that it could also refer to the justification as for what a contribution does for a debate. So when we're talking about the end goal or the end goal of an analysis, this is essentially the end outcome or the conclusion of a specific analysis. Let's say the way that debaters run an argument about let's say the idea run an argument in order to prove that legalizing abortion is important because it empowers the choices and empowers the autonomy of individuals. And then the analysis is to explain how exactly they empower women's choices and how you respect their choice and autonomy. And the conclusion to that is just, or the end impact of that or end goal of that is to prove or is to say that women have choices, we empower women through autonomy. So like the impact there is choice or autonomy in that regard. So that's the end goal of the analysis. The second type of what an impact looks like is, as I mentioned, you're trying to justify what specifically a contribution does for the debate. So similar discussion about the choice being a benefit. Debaters explain that the impact of choice in debate expands what women in the feminist movement may be interested in and expands what empowerment could look like as opposed to it being limited to what the existing definition is in debate. So there's a difference in being able to say that the impact is choice versus being able to say why choice is important for the rest of the debate or for the rest of the actors that teams are trying to say are important for the debate or are important actors that we must cater to within a debate. So it's like trying to explain the significance or what specifically a contribution does for the rest of the debate or why it's so significant to take note of this specific contribution or this specific material within a debate. So in the simpler word there is like it's kind of like meta. Yeah. So the Is this the second? But anyways, another type of contribution is examples and matter. So this could look like specified matter that can be used by debaters to explain to judges why something is likely to happen or is already existing. Remember that as an ordinary intelligent voter, you don't really know what the specific policies of the IMF are, but debaters can use examples or different matter to illustrate and discuss what those specific policies look like and help you better understand how the organization such as the IMF operates. So it's not necessarily meant to be considered an argument or a response, but it is a means to help further deepen the analysis of a contribution of an argument. So I think this is something that is important to highlight because there are instances where debaters would try to respond to things based on an example or based on matter. Like they will disprove things by saying that, okay, that's not true because this fact exists. And while that is fair to say, I think debaters also need to be able to do more in being able to highlight or at least discuss why this therefore disproves something. Because there are instances where they will just cite matter or they will just cite an example, but they do not necessarily explain how exactly that example or matter is significant or what it even does for the debate. So debaters end up need to at least make the active effort to be able to link that dot or to link that conclusion or that impact of this. Therefore, makes their mechanism or their argument irrelevant, considering the existing facts on hand and status quo, things like that. The reason why I'm talking about the different types of contributions is so that when you are assessing and tracking debates, you're able to understand how to credit certain material, or at least are able to understand what specific material that you are assessing does for debate, or to what extent is this significant in being able to play a key role in your decision making and the way that you overall assess the debate. So, yeah. When you finally understand what the contributions are, like as you track, you understand this contribution coming from OG or this contribution coming from opposition. These are things that are forms of mechanisms, forms of incentives, likelihoods, or like they're a form of response. You now have to make a comparison between the different materials and between the different contributions that teams give you. So judges do not evaluate contributions and arguments in cases of debaters in a vacuum. It is always in relation or in comparison to another team's material. So this is where you start the question. For example, were they able to prove XYZ better than their opponents? Were they able to justify that XYZ is more important than the ABC of their opponents? Who is able to mechanize or prove their impacts better? Or how is X team better able to prove impacts, conclusions, analysis better than their Y team? I think it is important to note that you cannot give the win or loss to someone just because they made mistakes by themselves. You can only give a win or loss to someone when there is another team to compare them to. There is no winner if there is no loser, and there is no loser if there is no winner. So the idea of being able to compare material, like it's not enough that you give a win to a team just because they executed the case flawlessly. It always has to be in comparison to how they did it, in comparison to another team, right? So assessing comparisons could look like being able to find the clashes or issues that teams clashed and argued upon as they were providing contributions, and then evaluating how they did in those clashes or how they answered and resolved those issues. So, for example, in a feminist debate, an issue of where women better empowered is raised. So government clashes with opposition, saying that it is when she's given the choice to opt into abortion, whereas opposition says it is when her personal beliefs are respected. Both sides try to argue for a similar goal of having like women empowerment, but they have different mechanisms to achieve that same impact or to achieve that same goal. As a judge, it's important to be able to spot these points of comparisons, these points of clashes or issues, as not all debaters will make it as clear-cut as for what specifically they are trying to achieve or clashing on. At the point that you find these clashes or issues of debate, this is where you can start comparing how teams answered such issues or clashes, and how you can compare how well they were able to resolve such issues and clash. Ultimately, what judges assess is not the contribution of a team as a whole, but how their contributions interact with the debate and the other contributions coming from different opponents. So I hope that's clear. Weighing. So let's talk about weighing. So now that you're able to make comparisons between, or like when you're able to compare the different contributions coming from team, how do you weigh one over the other? So generally, weighing refers to how you plan to credit and give weight to certain contributions more so than others. It's usually based on the value or metrics of debate or that judges use to assess the debate. So earlier when we were talking about what judges particularly do when they judge, right? It mentioned there that they have like a relatively shared criteria, but I do want to highlight that the shared criteria of judging isn't it isn't like a it isn't like standards that you consistently use all the time in every debate, as the metrics and standards that you use in order to evaluate debates always evolve depending on how the debate manifests. And that's actually the next slide. Standards and metrics. So the metrics and standards of how you arbitrate and assess debates are relative, meaning they depend on what happens in the actual debate in and of itself. So judging debates are the same. The values and interests you adjudicate in debate depend on what manifests and happens in the exchange. So metrics like the extent of responses or mechanization of points are not necessarily standards that we use all the time as judges. Sometimes the debates that you judge are so good that every other team does amazing in responses, mechanization, and ultimately it becomes a bit difficult to say that a way a team substantiated and proved their point was relatively better than another, because you might think both were amazing in being able to mechanize and substantiate these things. Sometimes the standard or the metric ends up becoming who exactly was better able to clarify or clear up the debate as opposed to another team or as opposed to their opponent. The standards that you use in debating is not a checklist. Some standards do not apply to some debates, and some standards are not as important to your decision as a judge. So I think that is important to highlight. These things could always evolve over time and could always change depending on the different debates that you are judging. But I will give you examples of different metrics. So these are like the sample of the quote-unquote shared judging criteria that was noted in the previous slide, which I also got from the WDC Judge Manual, which I suggest everyone should read. Anyways, here's like a screen cap of some of the metrics that exist. So firstly, some mechanization and substantiation. So this refers to how well a team logically proves that something is true or likely to happen. Second is unweighing engagement. Third is extent of impact's vulnerability, nuance, meta justification, responses, extent of responses, or characterization of frames. So like, I'm not going to read all of this. I think like, if you are watching this lecture, you could probably pause and then take a screen cap of what these different metrics look like. But these metrics in and of themselves are not exhaustive. They can always change. You might have different metrics in being able to assess different debates. So by the time that you are finished weighing or being able to understand how exactly by the time that you are finished weighing, particularly giving credit to certain material over the other, you are finally able to make a decision, or at least ideally you should be able to make a decision. So 15 minutes after the debate, that is used for judges to convene and come up with a decision. And BP adjudication, judges can convince other judges to switch their decision at the case that there is a disagreement or difference in ranking. Let's talk about deliberations then. How do you navigate deliberations as a chair? And this is particularly in the context of British parliamentary. So chair judges are the ones that manage deliberations, deciding which panelists or wing judges can speak first when sharing their thoughts or the decision on the round. They're also the ones that grade panelists, wings, and trainees, post-panel discussions, have to manage deliberations with panelists while also preparing to deliver an OA. They can disagree with decisions of other panelists or have different decisions, and then try to convince them to switch sides or to switch their decisions. So I think it is important to highlight here that deliberations is essentially where you can sway other panelists to change their vote or decision, or be influenced by other panelists, by other wing judges to do the same. If by the end of the 15-minute deliberations, there is no consensus has been given, particularly on no one has agreed on what the actual decision is, or no one has been fully convinced to switch their decision, usually the judge panel, holds a vote and the majority decision stands. If the chair is in the minority of the decision, so let's say they are the minority vote in that vote, they may appoint a panelists from the majority and require them to deliver the OA or a part of the adjudication. And I just want to highlight that, okay, because in previous years, the judge manual, the world's judge manual, explicitly noted that even if you were a chair and you were in the minority and you disagree with the decision, it was just really a suggestion that you could appoint a panelist to give the OA instead, particularly a panelist from the majority to give the OA instead. And more often than not, panelists wouldn't want to face the music. They wouldn't want to give the OA, so they'd still force the minority chair to give like the majority decision to give that OA. But now, with the judge manual being updated as of 2023, instead of it being a suggestion that judges can do, chairs can require, so it's no longer a suggestion, it can require panelists to be able to give a decision, particularly if the chair is in the minority vote. So in this case, chairs may ask the panelists to give a part of the adjudication, they may give a part of the OA, particularly on the point in which they disagreed with, or the entire OA in and of itself where the chair gets rolled. A roll meaning like they lost the vote. Okay, yeah. How do you navigate deliberations as a panelist? And this is also assuming BP. So unlike the chair, panelists or wings do not manage deliberations, but are still required to participate. When asked by the chair, they share their thoughts or decision on the round and answer any questions given to them by the chair or fellow panelists, particularly on why their decision was so. They don't give an oral adjudication in deliberations, but instead discuss specific comparisons in the debate that help formulate and justify why their decisions put one team over the other. Do note that chairs are always going to struggle with time management, especially in BP deliberations, because as they're trying to listen to you, they are also trying to formulate their notes and being able to provide their oral adjudication. So if you are also giving an oral adjudication during the deliberations, even though you are not required to, and let's say it doesn't necessarily answer the question that the chair has initially provided to you, I think like those are instances where chairs are probably not going to appreciate it, because you're going to end up eating too much time from deliberations. So as a panelist, you need to be able to formulate different justifications in a way that answer any of the questions that your chair or other panelists provide, and do so like briefly, but at least comprehensively. So it has to be like a healthy balance. You don't need to give an OA during deliberations. It's just a matter of being able to participate in the discussion, in providing providing your perspective as for why you thought another team won over the other, especially in cases of disagreement, or if there is extent of an alignment, trying to discuss what is similar between other panelists, or at least what you might add onto the discussion beyond what panelists have said. Deliberations in the Asian parliamentary format or AP format is quite different though. Unlike BP, there is no consensus judging, meaning judges do not talk to one another in order to be able to sway each other's decision. Instead, all judges, inclusive of the trainees, will be giving an oral adjudication to teams. So no discussions between panelists and chair beyond asking what the decision is among judges and discussing or deciding the order of who delivers the oral adjudication. It's important to note, again, judges do not try to convince or influence other panelists' decisions. Judges are still given 15 minutes to deliberate by themselves and formulate their own OAs during that time. How exactly does the order of OAs go? So at the case that everyone in the panel had the same decision, this is the unanimous decision, the order of the OA goes as, first you have the trainee going first, the second is the panelist, and the third or the last one being the chair giving their OA. I think it is also important to highlight that you're not allowed to listen to each other's OAs unless you are done with your OA. Meaning, you as a trainee are not, you as a chair are not allowed to listen to the OAs of the trainees and the panelists if you haven't given your OA yet. However, a trainee who has gone first is allowed to be able to listen to the panelists and the chair, assuming that the trainee has already given their oral adjudication before the panelists and chair's OA. At the case that you have a split decision where there is a minority majority, like people just have generally different decisions. If the chair is the minority, they will be part of the judges that deliver the OA first. So as opposed to being last, they will be part of the very first few that will be first. Otherwise, if they are in the majority, then they will give the OA last, and still follows the same idea of the trainee, the panelists, and the chair. Let's talk about oral adjudication then. So this is the means in which judges explain to debaters what their decision is, how they came to that decision, and weigh and compare the contributions of teams to explain and illustrate their decision-making process. This is where debaters score you as a judge based on your oral adjudication, and OAs are generally just 10-minute speeches provided by chair judges, if this is BP, but in the case of AP, it's a 10-minute speeches provided by whoever else is in the panel. So what exactly are debaters looking for in OAs? So there are two main things that debaters try to look for. Firstly, in terms of issues, second, in terms of tipping points. Issues, this is mostly a reflection of how you understand the different issues or clashes and general goals and questions that teams were trying to achieve and answer, as reflected from the different recaps that you might provide in the debate or in your oral adjudication. So they're trying to look for how exactly you were trying to assess the debate, at what point were you trying to compare the two teams, and that's why it's important to highlight what exactly was the issue that teams were trying to debate on or clash upon. Then the second one being tipping points. So this is where you try to explain at what point did you think a particular team was going over another team, or why are the metrics and standards that you thought of something, and why are these metrics that you initially thought of are something that you considered when making your decision. How come XYZ swayed you to decide and give the certain team the win? And this is also where you start to explain why is it so important that these contributions and their interaction became the basis for your decision. So the tipping point is, as already intuitively stated, it is the point in which this swayed you to lean to another team's contribution or lead to another team's side because of whatever metrics or whatever standards that you might have imposed, or what specifically that teams did that made you feel like they should be winning at that point or at that issue. So here's just like a general structure of what an oral adjudication looks like. First, it's you giving the decision. The second is general comments. The third is the justification. I think it's important to note that, so in previous years, or like in other circuits, not in other circuits. In previous years, usually the way that oral adjudications went was general comments and then decision and then the justification. But with online debating and how everything has evolved throughout the debate meta, usually debaters highly appreciate if you are more transparent from the onset, just by providing the decision from the onset and then proceeding to your general comments and justification. This is also being reinforced when you have like judge tests in different majors. Judges, there are instances where where Adj scores for different majors would brief debaters and judges, noting that it's preferred that you give the decision first and then discuss your general comments and justification. So in the case of general comments, this is not necessarily a requirement. This assumes that you have general comments in the first place, but they shouldn't be the priority of your OA. They're usually used to contextualize what judges saw in the debate, particularly the common problems applicable to teams in the round and how such things affected the quality of the round. So it's like general feedback that debaters could improve on, regardless of whatever side that they're on or whatever team that they're on. In terms of justification, it's generally being able to explain how you got to your decision. So this is an explanation of your thought process. How exactly did you view the debate to the point that you needed to make that decision or to make that ranking? So this is where you explain what those issues are and what exactly the tipping point is. So the issues could also serve as like the brief recap, particularly what were teams trying to fight on and how exactly they were trying to fight on it. And then the second part is being able to evaluate or assess the different contributions that were provided under the specific issue or under the specific clash. And then the third thing then is to be able to explain to what extent were these contributions credited, or to what extent was this contribution weighed more over the other based on whatever metrics that you might have imposed or was able to derive as the debate happened, whether that's based on everything that teams gave. To what extent were they able to prove the mechanisms? To what extent were they able to prove the impacts? How exactly did they weigh those things? Why exactly was me or was you judging or weighing, crediting teams based on how they weighed or based on how they mechanize things so important for the debate, or so applicable for you to give that decision in the first place? So beyond debaters trying to explain to you what the impact of their contribution is, you as a judge also have to explain to what extent does a specific contribution do for the debate and how that made you perceive that a particular team was already winning. So this is what I talk about when you have to reference how you track the debate, or at least how tracking is integral in being able to provide your decision as well as your justification. Because the way that you are able to understand how the different points interacted is also the way that you are able to better formulate the thought process, or being able to formulate your explanation as for how the debate happened, but secondly, also how you plan to credit or how you are crediting certain teams over the other, as well as whatever contributions might be weighing over the other. To delve in further for the oral adjudication structure, the justification could be divided into issues, clashes, that should be clashes, team by team ranks, and the like. So in an issue-based type of justification or issue-based type of structure, it's usually a question of what's a question or contention that teams had within debate? How did they answer such a question? And then discuss how X team did better to answer said question. In terms of clash-based justification, this looks like also asking similar questions of what exactly is the contention or disputed discussion within the debate? How did teams navigate through this dispute? And why is X team best able to either A, resolve that contention or solve that clash, or B, prove or win their side of that contention? The last type of justification is team by team or team ranks. And this is usually applicable to BP. So it's where you directly compare teams by relation to one another. So if you think the decision was an OO, CG, OG, or CO win, the structure of your OA would look like comparing why O had to get first place over CG, then why CG had to get second place over OG, then why OG had to get third over CO. It could also look like discussing what happened in the top half, OG, OO, closing half, CG, and CO. Then the diagonals, OG, and CO, and O, and CG, generally just being like a six-way diagonal, considering there are 6 points of interaction between the different teams. Generally, how you want to justify your decision, or particularly the structure of how you want to justify your decision, is something dependent on your preference as a judge, but it's highly encouraged that you try to explore and find the most comfortable option for you that can help you clearly explain your thought process. So personally, for me, I usually use an issue-based format, particularly, or issue-based and clash-based format, depending on how the debate revolved, whether or not the clashes and issues are clear. I usually only use team by team or team ranks as a structure when I'm usually judging BP. But like otherwise, if it's AP or Australs or any 3v3, I usually try to stick with issues. If the BP debate was a pretty comprehensive, pretty good debate, I'd also try to use issues. But if I have a difficulty in being able to find what the specific issues are and how those issues are applicable to all sides or to all teams within the house of a BP that round, usually I'd go for team by team or team ranks for the justification. Some other considerations though. So in each format, whether that's BP, AP, or Australs, or World Skills, etc., they all have their own set rules for judging, and it's important to read up on the rules of the format. Me talking about BP and AP format is just generally just me talking about the typical formats that the PDU usually engages in. But like if you plan to judge other debate formats, it's important that you read up on the rules. There's no point in judging when you don't understand what is within the scope of your responsibility as a judge. It's also important to note that I don't know why that slide why this other part of the bullet duplicated. Anyways, it's important to note that the rules of adjudication, especially BP, generally evolve and are subject to changes and revisions before the World Universities Debating Championship, or WDC, or a major international championship. It's usually to accommodate and adapt to the different trends and meta of the sport. So even if you say that you are a long-time judge, it's not enough that you just know how the format works. You also need to read up on the different manuals or the different briefings that each major tournament, or each tournament for that matter, gives. For example, in WDC, they literally revised the world's manual right before Madrid happened, or right before the 2023 World WDC. So and it changed up it changed up the way that you interpret certain motion types, the way you interpret certain motion types, or how you credit certain responses and certain principles and arguments, or the discussion about can you require a panelist to give the OA as opposed to suggesting that a panelist should give the OA. So it might seem tiny bits of things that change in the manual. Sometimes it could be a complete overhaul, but regardless, it is important that you stay up to date between the different briefings and the different manuals that are provided for whatever format that you are judging in. So generally, just make sure to read up on the manuals and briefings of every tournament you join, plus the WDC judge manual. So even if let's say it's a different format, I think a lot of the judging metrics, or the way that you perceive judging, is usually a reference from the WDC judge manual. So it's also just generally important to read that. It's also important to note that you don't necessarily need to be a great debater to be a great judge. You only need to know how the format works and be able to understand how debaters are operating and what their contributions do for the debate, to be able to assess and judge debates fairly. And then just being able to verbalize your thought process of how you understood the said debate. So the idea behind it is you just need the skill to verbalize and explain the thought process. And the second thing is your ability to track debates as a whole. You don't necessarily need to be a person that knows how to build good arguments and knows how to respond to things well. You just need to be able to track how things are flowing, and then explaining how exactly you credited those things, or how exactly you saw those things. If you're the type of judge that preps a motion during prep time, I personally strongly suggest against this practice. While it might seem valuable if you are also debating, it may create expectations for debate that you are about to judge, and you may end up subconsciously discrediting debaters who don't run the same arguments or who don't do the things that you expected. But if you trust yourself to not think of those subconscious expectations and biases, then I guess that's fine. But it's always better to be safe than sorry. So, yeah, that is for the first part of this lecture. I will record and send, or at least continue on to part 2, which discusses about tracking, how to better evaluate and weigh debates. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me or Outspoken people, I suppose. But my DMs, particularly on Messenger, are generally just open. My name is also Jill Icardo there, so you can find me. So yeah, thanks.